Okay, let's dive in. Get this. What if I told you that even though you might say you want to be happier, deep down, there's a there's a part of you actually resisting it, that you might be unconsciously blocking the very joy you claim you're after.
It's a really powerful idea, isn't it? Sort of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
That maybe the biggest hurdles aren't external things happening to us, but something internal, an unconscious pushback against feeling genuinely good.
Absolutely. And that fundamental idea is really what's guiding this deep dive today. We've gathered quite a bit of different notes, excerpts, all exploring this, really getting into the psychological stuff, the barriers that stop us living these, richer emotional lives we think we want.
Yeah, our mission, if you like, is to unpack these ideas,
Yeah.
to sort of shine a light on those invisible fences we seem to build around our own happiness, our own potential.
Right. We're going to look at the key insights from our sources. This idea of a psychological upper limit, maybe a baseline for how much happiness we actually let ourselves feel. And crucially, the kind of surprising ways we self-sabotage when we start to go past that limit.
hmm It suggests it's less about chasing happiness itself, maybe, and more about understanding how we're often wired to prioritize comfort, familiarity, even if that means less joy.
Okay, so the basic insight from the sources is this. We're fundamentally wired to chase our foremost desire.
Right, like in an emergency, that adrenaline surge, that survival kicking in, the strongest desire taking over.
Exactly. But day to day, that number one desire often isn't maximizing happiness. It's usually seeking comfort. Or maybe, yeah, familiarity is a better word.
And this is where that concept of happiness tolerance fits in. Gay Hendricks called it the upper limit. It's basically this like, unconscious boundary we draw around how much good stuff, feeling good, success, love we think we can actually handle.
Or like you said, an emotional baseline, the level we just naturally drift back towards.
Precisely. Think of it like a thermostat setting for happiness.
Okay, so it's not just about whether we can feel good, but this subtle, often invisible cap on how much good we allow ourselves. So when things in life opportunities, or even just, a really good week, push us past that familiar level, past that comfort zone, what actually happens then?
Well, the sources are pretty consistent on this. We unconsciously self-sabotage.
We mess it up for ourselves.
Kind of, yeah. And the surprising reason seems to be this programming to seek what's known. Even when we consciously think, yes, more happiness, our underlying system can default back to the familiar setting, even if that setting is, frankly, less happy than what's on offer.
So it's less a failure, maybe, and more just returning to the default.
That's a good way to put it, returning to the known quantity.
Wow, okay. That really reframes self-sabotage, doesn't it? It's not necessarily, I don't deserve this. It's more like, this feels unfamiliar. Let's get back to what I know, even if what I know is uncomfortable.
Exactly. The familiar discomfort can paradoxically feel safer than unfamiliar joy. And our sources dig into several specific psychological blocks, these impediments that keep us tethered to that old baseline, stopping us from really expanding our capacity for a better life.
Okay, let's unpack some of those. The first one you mentioned, that limited tolerance for feeling good. We know exceeding it triggers this retreat to comfort.
hmm And the key insight here is that, well, to expand your capacity for happiness, you actually have to get comfortable with the discomfort of the unfamiliar, the unfamiliarity of more good stuff happening.
That old saying, stepping outside your comfort zone.
It applies here just as much, yeah. It's not just for, like, external goals. It's crucial for expanding your internal space for happiness, too.
Yeah.
You literally have to practice handling the feeling of more joy, more peace, more success.
That makes sense. If you're only used to, say, a level 5 happiness, then level 7 feels weird, maybe even wrong somehow. What about this likability limit? That sounds like it taps into some deep social anxieties. Oh, absolutely. It's a huge one. This is that subtle break we put on our own success or happiness based on how we think other people will see us. It's this idea that we subconsciously try to maintain a level of achievement that's, admirable, people respect it, but, and this is key, it's not threatening to the people whose approval we crave.
Right. So it's not that we explicitly value, say, money over love, but there's an unconscious belief that achieving certain things will earn us that love or acceptance.
Precisely. That's often the underlying driver. And the sources suggest when we get close to a point where we worry our success might make others judge us or envy us or maybe even ridicule us.
When we cross that likability line.
Yeah. We often unconsciously pull back. We might downplay things, minimize our achievements, or sometimes even create problems just to sort of shrink back down to a size that feels safer, that keeps us in the pack.
That's a huge invisible barrier.
Yeah.
And it seems connected to another point, preferring the known comfort over unknown vulnerability,
Mm.
even when the unknown looks objectively better. It loops right back to that fundamental programming for familiarity, for what's known. Even if a different path clearly promises more happiness or fulfillment, the sheer uh, vulnerability of stepping into something new, something unknown, can keep us stuck right where we are, in the familiar discomfort.
Because at least you know that pain, right?
Exactly. It feels safer because the potential pitfalls are known.
Hmm.
The sources suggest really consciously looking at what we're truly seeking, maybe deep comfort, connection, purpose, and then trying to align our choices with paths that actually lead there, instead of just repeating familiar patterns that don't.
Choosing for what truly matters deep down, not just what feels familiar on the surface.
Okay.
And related to this, there's the fear that being happy means you have to give up on achieving more.
hmm The sources describe happiness, or at least one version of it, as a kind of acceptance, a sense of arrival. So if you've defined yourself by the struggle, by the striving, by the chase, then consciously letting yourself be happy now can feel, uh, well, it can feel like stopping the race, like giving up on those future ambitions.
But that's a false dilemma, isn't it? It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Absolutely not. The texts argue pretty strongly that the opposite is true. The path to a genuinely bigger, better life isn't paved with suffering until you hit some distant finish line. It's built, bit by actively cultivating joy, gratitude, meaning, purpose along the way.
So happiness isn't the reward after the suffering.
It's the foundation you build with, day by day. It's the building material, not just the end point.
That's a really powerful reframing. Okay, what about the gap between knowing what's right and actually, doing it? The knowing-doing gap.
Ah, yes, the notorious knowing-doing gap.
Yeah.
The sources point to this as a major, major source of suffering. It's rarely that we lack the information right. We often know what we should do. It's the resistance, the friction between what your rational mind knows is right or best for you long-term, and what feels easy or familiar or less scary in the immediate moment.
So the real pain isn't in the not knowing, it's in that resistance, that internal tug of war.
Precisely. That delay, that deflection, maybe thinking if you just wait it out or ignore it, the uncomfortable truth will somehow shift or go away. It just digs the hole deeper. It compounds the discomfort and actually increases the suffering while you avoid making the shift that's needed, whether that's internal or external.
Right. Avoiding the change creates its own kind of pain, a drawn-out discomfort.
Huh.
Okay, another one. Believing apathy is safety.
This one comes from a deep fear of loss, basically. Fearing the pain of losing people or things you care about, some people try to preemptively numb that pain. They don't allow themselves to feel strong attachment in the first place. It's like trying to minimize future suffering by opting for a kind of low-grade numbness now.
It feels like a form of emotional self-protection, trying to build walls.
On the surface, yeah, it looks like that.
Hmm.
But the sources offer a counter perspective, often by bringing up impermanence. Yes, things change, things end, that's true. But the argument is that this very impermanence is what gives life. And what we have, its meaning, its preciousness. The fact that it won't last forever is what makes it sacred.
Okay, so the choice isn't really between feeling something and feeling nothing. It's between two different kinds of experience.
Exactly. That's how it's framed. You can suffer that sort of chronic low-level pain of numbness, cutting yourself off to try and avoid potential future loss. Or you can choose to dive in, have an incredibly full, vibrant life, connect deeply, and then face the potential pain of loss when it comes, having had the immeasurable richness of the experience itself.
That definitely puts the choice in starker terms.
Mhm.
And related to choosing feeling, the sources mention something that sounds a bit strange. A lack of practice in feeling good.
It does sound odd, doesn't it? Practice feeling good. Like, shouldn't that just happen? But the sources really insist it's essential. It's one of the main ways you consciously expand that upper limit we talked about, how you raise your emotional baseline, and it's how you actually assimilate new positive chapters in your life without unconsciously blowing them up just because they feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable.
Okay, but how do you actually practice feeling good? What does that look like?
It's about being active and intentional. The sources suggest really simple things, actually, like consciously taking an extra moment to really savor a positive feeling when it comes up. Extend that little rush of gratitude after someone's kind to you. Meditate for just a minute on a moment of genuine joy from your day. Let that feeling really wash over you instead of just moving on.
So intentionally dwelling in the positive.
Yes, seeking it out and dwelling in it. By doing that, you're basically training your nervous system, your whole being, to handle more of it. You're expanding your threshold for good feelings.
That really pushes back against the common belief that happiness is just, a byproduct of good circumstances happening to you.
It absolutely does. And people who believe circumstances dictate happiness
Yeah.
often find this practice idea hard to swallow because it feels backward. It seems logical to wait for the external event, the promotion, the relationship, the lottery win to make you happy. It feels easier, too, emotionally, because it
Yeah.
doesn't require that internal effort, that conscious cultivation.
But the sources argue that waiting approach is ultimately flawed, right?
Yeah, fundamentally flawed. It leaves you constantly riding the roller coaster of external events, bouncing between fleeting highs, unless you actively work on cultivating your internal baseline happiness. The sources often point to examples like, say, studies showing surprising levels of happiness in some materially impoverished countries, or deeply peaceful individuals who own very little. The common threads aren't possessions, but internal states. A strong sense of purpose, community belonging, love, things you can cultivate largely irrespective of external circumstances.
So, real sustainable happiness isn't about what you have externally, but the internal state you're actively nurturing. Which connects to another point, the belief that our emotional baselines can't actually shift.
Right. This often comes out as, oh, that's just the way I am, attributing things like chronic anxiety or fear or just a generally low mood to some fixed personality trait.
I'm just a worried person, or I've always been a bit pessimistic, hear that all the time.
Exactly. And the sources challenge this directly. They argue that very little of that is an essential, unchangeable part of you unless you decide it is, especially things like anxiety or fear. They're often described not as fixed traits, but as learned behaviors, maybe, or unchecked reactions from the ego signals that something isn't right, that something needs attention or change. But instead of making the often difficult internal shift required, we find it easier to blame external situations or just declare, well, that's just me.
So, anxiety isn't necessarily your identity. It could be a signal you're misinterpreting, maybe while trying to avoid an uncomfortable internal adjustment.
That's a powerful way to think about it, yes. Another barrier they discuss is this belief that suffering somehow makes you worthy of good things.
Ah, right. The idea that you haven't truly earned the wonderful stuff in life unless you've gone through significant hardship first. The no pain, no gain applied to happiness itself.
Precisely. There's this unconscious feeling that good things received without a struggle aren't quite deserved, or maybe aren't really yours in the same way. And the sources suggest there's a scary flip side to this. If good things can just happen without your intense effort or suffering, then, well, maybe bad things could happen just as randomly without you doing anything specific to cause them. That perceived lack of control can feel terrifying.
So, wanting to feel like you earned the good might also be a way of trying to feel like you have some control over preventing the bad.
Potentially, yeah. It could be tied into that need for control. And speaking of trying to control the uncontrollable, there's the tendency to try and beat fear to the finish line.
Is this basically about worrying? Constant worrying.
It is. The sources describe worry as almost like a cultural pastime for many of us, a kind of deflection, maybe, from the extremes, either not caring at all or caring so intensely it feels overwhelming. We worry, the suggestion goes, often as an attempt to kind of condition ourselves, to brace for the worst possible outcomes, thinking it'll lessen the pain if they actually happen, or sometimes just to feel like we're doing something about irrational fears.
So, worry feels productive, like preparation or a shield.
It feels like it, yeah. But the sources argue pretty strongly that it just doesn't work. You can't truly prepare your emotions for every possible difficult event. You certainly can't know what other people are really thinking. And you absolutely cannot prepare for irrational fears because, well, they're irrational. You can't actually beat fear to the finish line by worrying about it constantly. In this framing, worry isn't preventing pain. It's actively choosing to experience more pain right here, right now in the present moment.
Wow. That's a really challenging thought that my worry isn't protecting me at all. It's actually just making me suffer now for something that might never even happen.
It's a tough one to internalize. And finally, they touch upon the perception, the stigma almost, that happy people are somehow naive or vulnerable.
Ah, yes. That idea that if someone seems genuinely happy and optimistic, they must be clueless, right? Or ill-informed, maybe living in some kind of denial, disconnected from reality.
Mm. The sources suggest this perception often comes from people who are maybe using it to justify their own negativity or their own inertia. They're feeling that they can't control the negative circumstances in their life, so how could anyone else genuinely be happy?
So judging the happy person is less about that person's actual state and more about the judger needing to rationalize their own position.
That's often the implication, yes.
Yeah.
And the sources offer a really powerful counter-argument here. They ask, who is truly the naive and vulnerable one? Is that the person who chooses joy, embraces life, builds meaning, even though they might face loss later? Or is it the person who doesn't choose to step into a better life, who holds back out of fear? Because, the person who embraces life might risk losing what they have eventually. But the person too afraid to fully live risks having nothing meaningful at all in the first place.
Wow. Okay. So the real vulnerability isn't in having something precious and maybe losing it, but in never having it because fear kept you from even trying.
That's the gist. Pulling all these different threads together, the source material really presents a profound challenge to how we usually think about happiness. And these impediments, these barriers we've discussed, they matter because, well, chances are they are operating probably unconsciously in your own life right now, subtly shaping your choices, limiting your experience.
Yeah, it's worth taking a moment to really reflect. Which of these patterns kind of pinged for you? Where might you be hitting your own upper limit without realizing it? Or defaulting back to that familiar discomfort instead of reaching for genuine joy?
Because the central message, distilled from all these sources, seems unmistakable. Sustainable happiness isn't just some lucky break that depends on your circumstances hitting the jackpot. It's the result of intentional, mindful, daily practice. Challenging these internal barriers we've talked about, it really starts with recognizing you have a choice and then committing to cultivate that internal state, bit by bit, day after day.
So we've taken this deep dive into this really challenging idea that, we might be unconsciously fighting against the very happiness we say we want. We've looked at the upper limit, the comfort baseline, and all these surprisingly common psychological roadblocks that keep us anchored to what's familiar, even if it's not fulfilling.
And the core takeaway, really, is that breaking through these self-imposed limits doesn't just start with awareness, though that's crucial. It starts with a conscious decision, a decision to practice feeling good, to challenge that seductive pull of comfortable discomfort, and to actively, intentionally expand your capacity for joy.
And to leave you with something to think about, our source material offers this really provocative final thought. Perhaps the greatest space of suffering isn't actually the lack of knowledge.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
not knowing what to do,
Mhm.
but rather it's the resistance, that often huge gap that exists between knowing what's best or right for you and actually finding a way to do it.
Which really leaves us with a crucial question for you to consider.
Hmm.
What could genuinely change in your life, maybe starting today, if you began consciously, actively working to close that gap?